of Genesis, and we've been having a long series of sermons on Joseph, who was such a great leader, patriarch in the Old Testament. And we're going to be looking in chapters 42 to at least 45. So it's a piece here and a piece there. I'm not going to read the whole thing, so I don't have to worry about that. But do get over to that part of Genesis so that you can find the scriptures I'm referring to. Have you been watching the news concerning the situation in Syria? Bashar Assad has been a thorn in the side of the world for many, many, many years. A difficult person. And now he's in this life and death struggle with a rebellion that all began with the so-called Arab Spring nearly 3 years ago now. And in that country, unlike Tunisia, where it was really quite peaceful transition on the whole, the struggle in Syria has been openly violent from the beginning and just seems to be intensifying. And of course, it's a society that is deeply, deeply divided, much like some of the countries in that part of the world. A minority population, minority religious group in that country, the Assad belonged to, took power by force and maintained that power by force in a deeply violent way. And it's led to a society that, while it was divided already, now is horribly divided in a deep and a powerful way. And there's been a common call for, as we put it, regime change, which is a nice way of saying having a revolution. And we want somebody else in power, and the locals are saying this, and we as well, America, is saying we need something different. We can't have people dropping chemical weapons on their own populations and killing them by the thousands indiscriminately. We cannot deal with, somehow we can deal with 20 and 30 at a time, mounting to thousands, but not all at once. And it's just a terrifying thing, maybe these chemical weapons at the door that might open. But this week, somebody finally asked the pertinent question that if we're going to get rid of Assad, what do we want to have in his place? Who's going to come to power after he is gone? As dangerous as he's been, as difficult as he has been, who is going to come to power? And the likely answer is it's some radical Islamist group that would be belonging to one faction or another. And these groups are fighting on both sides of the revolution. Some are with the rebels, and some are with the government, and they're fighting. And what we don't really know is that individual rebel groups of these Islamist groups that are fighting with the rebels, they'll be attacking each other too. You see, because they're not looking just at the end of this revolution, they're looking to the end of the whole thing. And as soon as Assad is gone, then all these factions are going to be fighting it out to see who it is that's in charge. And it's going to be the most violent, the most dangerous, and the most ruthless of parties. That's what it's going to be. We really want that instead. It's very difficult for us to see how this can ever be reconciled into a society that really, really, really works, where they can be governed in a way that we would recognize as an equitable government. See, that's exactly the problem with Assad. He was brought to power, the family was brought to power by his father, who leveled entire cities with the people in them in order to take control. This is who they are, what they've done, and how they live. How are we going to find a way to have peace? How can there be a reconciliation of society so that they can live together? It's hard to see how they are possible to happen, isn't it? But reconciliation is not easy for any of us. And it's mentioned in 2 Corinthians. I tell you Genesis, and I'm going to read from 2 Corinthians. But this is important because it's about us. 2 Corinthians 5:17 through 19. Where Paul writes, the old is gone and the new is here. All this is from God who reconciled himself to us through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation, the method of peace. More than the absence of war, the reestablishment of relationship, of connection, of cooperation, of being a part of the same group. That's what reconciliation to see how that will ever happen in Syria. Very hard for us to see. How can we hope to break through all the conflict that's even around us in our world? That's the key, that Christ has made the way. He's made the break. He's made the difference. And we need to focus on that. And we see the story of one family dealing with its issues in Genesis. In 37 to 45, it's a long story. You'll remember that Joseph, one of the younger sons, he's the son of the favorite wife. He's a man who found trouble. And he lived in a family that put the dysfunctional. You know what I mean? Really, they are the measure and the standard of it. Jacob, the father, lived up to his name, which means the tripper or the tricker, the one who pulls a prank. He's a man who, as a young man, swindled his older brother out of the birthright. Because his older brother was careless and carefree and ran wild, when he came home hungry, Jacob said, I got some food here. You can have it if you hand over the birthright of the first son. And his brother did it. And he didn't have it. That wasn't enough. When his father was old and dying and looking for his sons to bless, he tricked his own father, who was blind and weak and about to pass away, tricked him into thinking that Jacob was the older brother. And so received from him all the blessings, and his brother Esau was left out in the cold, rejected and driven away. He was a tricker. And like all trickers, he's vulnerable to the same thing. Because he had to leave his own home because of his brother Esau, who was a man's man and a wild man, he went to his uncle Laban's. And he found out what trickery was like because Laban was a past master. That's the problem with trickery. You're vulnerable to it. In those days, it was customary for every man to bargain and to barter for a wife. And so at his uncle's house, he met his cousin. This is all pretty freaky. His cousin, whose name was Rachel. She was beautiful, and he saw her. And in order to barter, since he didn't come away from home with anything, he said, I'll promise you 7 years, I'll work for you 7 years. Rachel is my wife. And after 7 years, he was married and woke up married to Leah, not Rachel. It's one of those things. You want to talk about a trick. And so that relationship was born in there. The conflict. And there are 2 wives now. One was love, the other was not. Rachel was beautiful. Leah could have children. And those 2 things are powerful because Jacob was to have a family. He was to establish himself. And he was to be any meaningful person in his world. That family was the essence of it. And so these 2 women were in conflict. Oh, he loves me more. Oh, yeah. Well, I provided him a family. When the boys inherit it all, you're out on your ear, lady. Can you see the conflict going on there? The violence, the raging, and the bitter feud between his sisters. And it wasn't just them, because then the children became involved. Finally, when Rachel had children, it was Joseph, the youngest. And that conflict came down to him. You see, they're always competing for resources. Everybody's always competing for resources. And with the family, it was Jacob's approval, Jacob's time, Jacob's blessing. Rachel, the hot chick. Leah did for the family maker. And they never missed a chance. I imagine they never missed a chance to rub in each other's face. And so the family is at war. It's always on edge. They're looking to do one another in one way or another. How would it ever be reconciled? How would they ever be able to work out the harms and the hurts that had been done? It's by coming to terms with personal guilt. The same way that we are reconciled with God. We have to come to terms with our personal guilt. You know, the brothers had thought they had gotten away with murder by taking out their grudge against Joseph. They threw him in the pit. They were going to kill him. But finally, it said, let's just sell him. We'll send him down country. We'll send him off to Egypt. And they sold him for 30 pieces of silver. Have you heard that number of silver before? The story of Christ, isn't that right? When he was betrayed for 30 pieces. Isn't it interesting how it's almost a symbol, not a real number, about the giving I'm sure they thought, but we'll never go down to Egypt. We'll never see him again. But it didn't turn out that way at all, did it? Chapter 41, we find out that there was a famine in the world at that time, a time of emptiness and hunger. And 41, 56, 57, it's written, and the famine had spread over the whole country. And Joseph opened the storehouse and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. And suddenly, the one thing that they thought they would never have to do, that was exactly what they were doing. They were going down to Egypt. And I'm sure that if they ever thought about Joseph, they would have thought there's never a chance in that huge country that we would ever see him, or come across it, or if it did, he would have anything to say for us. But they did, didn't they? You know, we humans think that we make choices that are free choices, this or that. But the truth about life is most of the things we do are governed by our circumstances, about what we need, where it's available, how we're going to get it. And we are guided into places. And so it was for Joseph's sons. They thought they could choose what they wanted, but because of God's hand in the world, they were brought back to the one place they didn't want to be. Their circumstances dictated what it was that they were going to do. The opportunity God was looking for. They were men looking for food, and the only person with food to sell was Joseph himself. And we find out that they come into his presence and don't know it. Chapter 42, 7 and 8. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from, he asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. And although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You are spies. It says Joseph remembered his dream. Don't you think that it was a cause of trouble to him? The hardship was to him when he told his brothers that he dreamed that he would rule over them and be the power. And it must have mocked him many times as he'd been sent off to Egypt, tied up, bound up, maybe even in chains, and hauled along, and then sold at an auction and put in as a slave in a household, and from that slavery rising until he was sent away again and put in prison because of false accusations. The damage was done. I wonder how many times he thought back to that dream and said, oh, this is working well. Haven't we all felt that way? This is working well. Where's the promise of the good world that we're supposed to have? So Joseph must have thought of his dream, the promise that he would be the leader, that he would rule, that he would guide. Here he is looking at the brothers who are completely in his power. He can sell them food or not. But that's the small part. He can call the soldiers and have them killed or not. No one would ever question him. And he must have thought, if he is human at all, he had to have thought,